Yeah, go for it.
Very good. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. I think we've only got Niall and Jack are the only two new people from last week, I think, yeah?
Yep.
So just a very, very quick introduction to who I am. Tom O'Leary is my name, and I have a company here based in Tralee and Kerry, and we work with not-for-profit organisations and small businesses on project planning, project development, strategic planning, business planning, feasibility studies, and I suppose most importantly, and what's most relevant to this evening is sourcing funding and grant applications. So we're delivering these workshops on behalf of the iCatch network. So start last week, this evening, and next week. I think everyone got the email I sent out to you last week. Just with I looked what funding was currently available. That was open for applications, some with fairly immediate deadlines, and then others maybe a bit pushed out. So I just been through my normal sources there to see what was out there, and I sent those on to you. I know some might have been kind of irrelevant, but I said, look, I'll put them out anyway to see what you thought of them. And as I was saying last week, just to make this more practical, the workshops we might focus on a kind of a just generic application to go through content of an application form of what goes into it and how we should word the application and what's relevant and what's not so much relevant. And what are the key things that a person assessing the application will look for? So we'll cover that this evening. So I think I was talking to Liz earlier on about this, and I know last week a lot of people mentioned about leader funding as being probably one of the most important ones and the most accessible one for most organizations. So we might cover that. And the other thing with a leader application is with leader funding applications, they're as probably as detailed as you will see in relation to any application. So if you're able to complete an application to leader successfully, you would have gone a long way to proven that you can actually apply to anyone for funding, because they are more complex. Just before we kick off the scene, because also what I cover this evening is kind of preparing for grants and what information you need to have in hand, and the kind of organization of that and file management as well. Because as I was saying last week, a lot of the issues with funding applications isn't so much the actual application form itself. It's all the other documentation and the other information that's required to go along with it. Usually with voluntary organizations, we have a lot of volunteers, and maybe no one specifically working full-time in an organization, accessing that documents or knowing where the documents are to access sometimes might be problematic. So we've just a very, very simple file management system that we kind of encourage our clients to use. So everything's on hand when they need it, and there's no kind of last minute rushing around. Just before we kick off this evening though, in relation to your own projects in the past or going forward, like what are your key issues, or have been your key issues in relation to not so much like the grants not being there, but in terms of applying for funding? What have been your main concerns, and what are the areas you feel you're kind of weak on that you could get support from me on improving those areas? Like, is any specific things that you're thinking, okay, I always struggle with this when it comes to applications? We would constantly come up against this hurdle, or are you having? I presume like you're looking to get more information on the application process. So, what's been the difficulties in the past with your applications, or what have you found most difficult in getting them over the line and getting them in on time?
Tom, can I
Yep.
just say contributions in kind? Just getting that right.
Okay.
Voluntary labor, because it's all in advance. So you're saying, I'm going to get 50 hours of voluntary labor. What if you don't? That kind of thing. So just to account for that. So,
yep.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. I'll cover that. Trish, isn't it? Yeah, so I'll cover that, Trish, from in relation to leader funding, because very specifically detailed in their guidelines how you count for voluntary labour, and I've got the guidelines downloaded just for this evening to go through them with you. So no, each fund has its own kind of guidelines around how you count for contributions in kind. But what normally we would do is we would contact the department or whoever the agency is dealing with it, just get confirmation from them in terms of how they will review the contribution in kind element of it and how they audit that. So sometimes sometimes they can be very vague in how they do that. So, for example, we got funding there recently under the Connected Hubs funding for enterprise units across the country, and they allow you to put in contribution in kind as being, like, say, offering your space for free for community groups, or doing something for the community, or providing support. And it's very, very vague, like, you know. So we said, look, if we put in 10,000 euros worth of, you know, let's say, space they're providing for free over 12 months, how do we actually record that, and how do we, you know, account for it, and how can we show that we're transparent? Because it's wide open for abuse. We said to them as well, you know, like, this could be you. We could just tell you there was meetings here, and you're not going to know. And they kind of said to us, we kind of trust you, and, you know, if you tell us those meetings there, we believe you. And then others will look for, you know, for verification from accountants to sign off and things like that. So it's all really down to the agency, but always get clarification from them, even if it's in the criteria and it might be very well laid out. Always get confirmation from them in terms of, if you get the grant approved, what's their audit procedures afterwards. And that's really important, because that's where a lot of groups they believe that they're following the criteria to the letter of the law, and they're doing everything they're supposed to be doing. But when it comes down to an audit, and especially if there's an external auditing team coming down to look at it, there might be certain things that you've overlooked, not on purpose, but just because you weren't aware of it, that could cause you issues, you know. So we always, we can plague the department really, and the people in charge, and ask them, you know, tell us exactly what I need to have in place here, and we go back and say, look, we've got X, Y, and Z in place, will that do? And also get that in writing from them as well. So if you always use email them and say, look, you know, can you get clarification on the following points? They'll email back and say, yes, that's correct, that's correct, that's correct. Then when it comes to audit, an audit situation, let's say 6 months after the fund has been approved and drawn down, you can go back and say, well, we got confirmation at that time from the department that this was correct, and we followed the guidance we got. If you don't have that, and you say, oh, we called them and someone said it, that won't work, you know. So it is something that a lot of people don't think about when they apply for grants. It's after the grants are being approved and the drawdown is sort of where a lot of the problems kind of come up, because the paper trails don't really match what was applied for, things like that. So it's really just about being organized and having a good system in place, you know. But always, even if you're 110% sure you're doing the right thing, always get confirmation from the department on that, just to make sure that they're happy with what you're doing. Because you can always fall back on that then if there's an issue down the line. Again, we had an issue with Enterprise Ireland there last year. They gave us guidance on there was an employment grant, and they had stated that the employers in PRSI, the employment taxes weren't included. And we went back to them and we said we can't accept certain elements because it was too much of a cost on the company. And they came back and they said, actually, no, we can allow the employment taxes as part of the grant. So we got them to give that confirmation in writing, so that now when we draw it down in March, I think it is, that their external auditors won't question that, and we won't have to give any money back to them. So we have it in writing from them. If it's wrong, that's their problem, not ours, you know, because we think they're wrong. But we have it in writing that they said do this and this is what we're doing. So just be careful with it, because there will always be, not always, but the department will always audit certain files. So for example, with leader funding, the department will go into the leader company, like the local development company, and they'll pick at random maybe 10 files to audit. And your file might be one of those unlucky 10, and they will literally go through that file with a fine-tooth comb, and they will look for issues with that file. So if there's paperwork that's not correct or right or accurate, or there's certain things not signed or whatever, that will cause you problems. So you always make sure that your files are correct. Now, in the case of Leader, the local development company, they have to make sure those files are correct as well, because they're ultimately the ones who are going to get in trouble if the files aren't correct. So there'll be kind of a double kind of account, kind of audit process going on there. But it's something to be aware of, because it does cause problems. Is there any other things besides, say, contribution in kind that you kind of struggle with in terms of the applications themselves, in terms of putting the application forms together?
Yeah, the landowner permissions.
Yep, good one. Yep, for you.
That's one that for a leader application, we had to get landowner permission. We asked them, what's the format? They said, we don't know, you come up with it. We went off then to the landowners. They went to their solicitors with a format we had. Some solicitors just rubber stamped it, no problem. Other solicitors came back and said, no, we're going to come up with a special license agreement. which costs money. Who's going to pay for it? Solicitor says, how big is your project? Then the cost started to ramp up. So we had to push the cost back to the landowner, and then they started to waver a bit. So that's one. Planning permission from the local authority or planning exemption.
Yep.
That's one that could catch you very easily as well.
Okay.
Something that's coming up as well is on a lot of our projects now is AA screening reports and EISs from an ecologist, where you didn't factor in that cost, and bang, there's maybe 2, 3, 4 grand that you have to stump up that you didn't plan for.
Okay.
ARCs, activity request consents from the National Parks and Wildlife Service. They hit us now. We're coming across that.
Okay.
IFI permissions, OPW section 50s, we're hitting them, so we are. And then the good old one at the very end, especially with leader and other projects, insurance, all the different insurance that we need. And the indemnity levels and public liability levels are rising every year, and it's
absolutely
near impossible.
Okay, and just taking those, Alan, in order, let's say, okay, the landowner permission, this has come up as an issue with some projects we've been working with as well. And the exact same thing, different solicitors have different takes, because the solicitors don't represent the landowner and they're going to look after their best interest. One of the things we did was there is a fairly good system in place for the walking trails and the National Trails Office, in terms of people walking across, farmers' lands or whatever, in terms of the indemnity clauses in there. It'd be worth looking at, would they suffice from a leader perspective, in terms of that, something similar to those permissions, if they would work?
Yeah, we actually used, IFI had a template they request for their funding, and we just changed that a little bit, put our words onto it.
Okay.
And we give that out to some of the landowners. They went off to the solicitors, no problem, we got it stamped. But then other solicitors came back to us and said, if we agree to that, you're given, say, a 7-year access to that land unconditionally. And the solicitors come back, well, if my client wanted to sell that land, your agreement with them could stop them selling the land, because you have a 7-year agreement. So they came up with a license agreement, which was a 3 or 4 page document where we waiver that right if they go to sell their land.
Okay.
But that cost the landowner hundreds, to get that. Now, he was happy enough, we're going to do work, and he was prepared to pay that.
Okay.
But other people wouldn't have agreed to that, and we would have to pay for that ourselves. So, it's just.
And in that case, Alan, in that situation, did the leader accept that the license agreement with that clause in there?
Both types, they accepted both formats.
Okay.
Once we had agreement, doesn't matter what the agreement was, whether it was pro-client or not, they accepted it.
But did that impact on, say, if leader funded a specific project, and there was that 7-year clause in there, in terms of, okay, this project has to be in place for 7 years, and say the landowner decided in year 2 that they were going to sell the property, and they basically went back to the clause in the agreement and said, okay, we're allowed to do this. Where the leaders stand in that situation, then, because in that situation, that the leader funding is gone pretty much with the sale of the land.
Well, that's the risk. Now, they didn't put any stipulation on that on us. They didn't, pull us tight on that. To be honest with you, this is new to leader. I think we were probably the second project in Ireland to pull leader funding for, say, riparian works. I don't think any other group in Ireland, and sort of we were guinea pigs for it. So they were learning from us, basically. But if you got into maybe, a sort of a tricky situation, and we, where that did happen. Looking up the kind of works we do, it's just, say, fencing off rivers and planting and stuff like that. So if a new landowner takes over, what can we do? Really?
I might just look into that a bit more, because it's an interesting one, because it's going to come up with a lot of the recreational projects as well, because the walking trails, because a lot of leader funding is going into doing surfacing works for those trails. And if that land is sold, that surfacing works that's being put in by leader funding is now no longer in the ownership of the group or of that individual farmer, let's say. So it is something that, because that could potentially cause problems down the line when it comes to an audit, that the department would say our funding is not protected here because there's a clause in that agreement.
Well, the danger is the new landowner could say, I'm taking out all of that
Exactly.
capital
That's the
works.
point. That's the point. Yeah.
Now, the work we are doing, chances are very, very slim.
Mhm.
We're given something that, increases the value of the land. So, but
Okay. In relation to,
Tom,
right.
sorry, I just want to say we have a similar problem, and ours relates to ownership as well of what we're doing in the riparian, because we're putting in, we're installing features, and the question has been who owns it, and then who owns it, who maintains it.
Yep.
So it's that problem as well, probably similar to Alan.
So the ownership, I know it's caused a lot of problems even with building projects in the past where the buildings were owned by, held in trust by maybe the local parish or something like that, or maybe a landowner from way back in the deeds are nowhere to be found, and that can cause major issues with projects. I know there was a project in Niche we were doing that was delayed by 18 months because they couldn't even find where the initial religion deeds were. And it come up and they had to go through a huge legal process to get the building transferred over to the group. So it can cause a lot of problems, but it just, I'll make a few inquiries because we have a rural recreational officer here down well, she's in South Kerry, but she's done an awful lot of work with landowners around access and looking at, how to protect their interests as well. So she might have some ideas, and I'll talk to the two leader companies on here we work with as well, because I know they've done a lot of work around, especially in South Kerry, a lot of work around recreational trails and blueways and things like that, where they had to go into private property to access land for their projects. Just see has come up and has been raised by the department, or even at EU level in terms of how it's going to be handled, because it potentially could cause problems down the line. Okay, in terms of the planning permission, that can be a tricky one, because in some cases, once you got planning applied for and a planning reference number, that would suffice at the application stage. And then in other situations, planning has to be approved and in place before you can apply for the funding. Obviously, if it's a case of the planning application that has just been applied for and you got a reference number, that's not that difficult. But if you've got to wait for a planning application to go through and be approved before you can apply, that can cause serious delays for a project. We're working on one project at the moment, two projects at the moment, which is deadline at the end of April, and we're only going for planning. That's going for planning at the end of this month to be ready for the end of April. But if there's any objection along the way, that means that project is gone then for another 12 months. So again, it can cause problems. With the another thing to be careful as well. If you're looking at feasibility study funding, or analysis and development funding from Leader, you can't put in a cost for planning applications and planning fees. They won't allow it, which is really annoying, and it's bizarre that they won't, but they won't allow you to cover planning costs. So if you're doing a feasibility study on a project that requires planning, on your application form and your costings, if you've got architect's fees in there, what I'd be suggesting to do is obviously don't put on where there's planning fees included or there's planning work included here, because they won't fund that. So keep it fairly generic, that there's maybe design concepts or there is planning information and advice provided by the architect, but there's no planning application being submitted. Okay, what you do with the architect after that, with the funding, is up to yourselves. But just make sure that's not in the application form. There's no mention of planning whatsoever, because they won't fund that. Which is kind of stupid, because the whole feasibility study is based on around, will the project start? So, if you can't use that money to apply for planning, you could have gone through a whole feasibility process and then afterwards spend a lot of money on a planning application and get turned on for planning, and the whole thing stopped anyway. So, but just they won't allow it. Into the EIS screening and other surveys that
just Tom, on the planning exemption, which would probably be more the case for us. Okay. Just to be careful there as well. We went to our planning officer exemption. They said, "What are you doing?" We explained the project. We're putting up fence and planting, and then we said we're going to put stiles, to make access into the river, and that just threw them all together. The stiles. Right, now, we could give them specs, Department of Agricultural specs for the fencing and the planting. They accepted that, no problem, as a spec. And they said, we never seen one of these styles constructed. What's it constructed of? What's the lifespan? What's the materials? How high will it be? Whatever. And we says, right, we're going to pull that element out of the project. And then we got exemption the next day from the planning office. So be careful what you ask for and wish for, and It just something simple like exemption, which costs €80, could have turned into a nightmare for us.
Yeah.
Getting an engineer to, to cert the plans and certify the plans and stuff like that. So just exemption is not as easy sometimes as you think.
But you said there you got the exemption on the styles, did you?
No, we took them out of the project just to make it simple.
Okay, so okay.
And we'll add them in ourselves on another project that isn't leader funded or something like that, where we're not tied down as such. But just a simple thing like that could have thrown the whole project. And at that stage, we had put a lot of time, effort, consultancy and all in planning into it, and just to fall on that one item, that we had to go full plan permission, which would have been a nightmare. So it would have been.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think what a lot of groups do is they'll engage with an architect to do kind of pre-planning meetings for them on their behalf, and to kind of see what's required and what's not required. In some cases, they will, like I know with the sports capital funding, for example, they would accept a letter from an architect or an engineer or someone that's qualified to make a call and saying that this project is not planning permission is not required. Because we found with a lot of in the planning department, one, they're not very quick in giving you a letter saying it's not required, and secondly, sometimes the time frame is so tight that by the time they actually get it out to you and get it back in and look at it and review it, so sometimes just doing the fast kind of track approach is an engineer provides you with a cover letter saying that this project, based on covering planning guidelines, whatever, is exempt from planning. But again, you're right in terms of if it's going to cause problems, you'll remove it because it is a nightmare scenario. But just go back to the funding side of it for the analysis and development. Just be careful with that you're not putting in planning permission or any mention of that in the application form, because it will mean your application form won't be assessed. They will cover things like, say, I presume the EIS screening and other surveys like that and impact surveys will be covered.
Yeah, the Law Pro had quite a bit of debate with the leader program and got a screening and all that incorporated into the fundings that they have. So that's official.
Yeah. Okay. So that would be allowed under analysis development, but the plan application won't be.
Or even your project. I think if your project needs that, and you haven't got an A&D part of it, your project, they'll still cover that cost.
Okay. And then the last two, I'm not familiar in terms of the MPWS and OPW criteria or the specifications they require. Are they specific to certain projects that you're working on, Alan, or are they required?
It depends if you're going to in-stream or if you're going to build a bridge or anything like that.
Okay.
If there's, it just depends on the project. You're safer going to IFI, OPW, NPWS and say, here, this is what we're going to do. Are you happy with it first? Or you could be caught later on. Okay,
and they'd be incorporated into your leader application as well, in terms of that you tick the box that you have all necessary surveys and agreements in place.
Yeah, well, for OPW, we looked at a section 50 for a bridge over a stream, and a 10 grand project turned into a 60 grand project very fast. So we quashed it quick, so it could have caught, like if we had plowed on and then OPW walked up the river and says, hold on lads, what are you at? We would have been in trouble. So just
Yeah, but I think that, and that's the important point on this, because the reason why leader look for all this documentation and all this kind of reassurances everything's in place is that if that was a scenario that you mentioned there, that you did what you were supposed to do or what you did, and the OPW came on afterwards and said, by the way lads, this is wrong, we have an issue with it, then that caused problems from a leader perspective, because now their funding's in jeopardy here because the work you've done wasn't supposed to. So that's why they look for planning. That's why they look for all necessary, consultation, the deeds, the permissions, all that in place. All they're doing really is, and I'm not here defending leader or local development companies at all, because not so much local, the leader criteria is the most complicated part of it. But I can see where they're coming from, having worked in the local development sector. Their job is to protect the funds and protect themselves and make sure that they're doing everything they possibly can do. They're not going to be audited by the department. If there's any risk that this project can't proceed because certain things weren't followed or certain agreements weren't in place at the time of application, but the applicant group said they were in place, then there's huge issues for everyone involved. So that's why they look for all these, reassurances that everything's in place at the time the application goes in. And the problem with that is a lot of groups say, yes, we've done X, Y, or Z, but they look for proof of that. And in some cases, they might look for all the proof at the time, but when it comes to, as I said, the audit, and the audit trail, and they go through the paperwork, and they'll say, well, hang on a second, when this application went in, this document wasn't in place, even though they said on the application form it was. So, there's been a lot of kind of, I suppose, in the past, whether it was done deliberately or whether it was purely, I don't know, just maybe, just, I don't know what, but there's been kind of oversight where certain things weren't in place at the time of the application being approved. And when the file was open, maybe a year down the line, that there was serious issues for the applicant group that got the funding and for the local government company who assessed it. So that's why there's so much checks and balances now with the leader applications, and it takes so long to get them approved because you've got to go through so many hoops to get approval, and there's so many different assessment stages. A lot of it's down to making sure that everything is right. Certain projects are very straightforward, but then more projects are fairly complicated because there's so many different variables put into the mix there. And one of those variables can cause you a huge problem because you can't progress onto the sorted. And as you said, they're having a lot of times it's literally kind of a learning process as well for the leader companies, that they haven't seen this before. Mm-hmm. They have no precedent set, and they're like, okay, what do we do now? And they're looking for rulings on it from the department, which takes forever. Then they're looking for rulings on it from the EU, which takes forever. And meantime, you're waiting there for someone to give you an answer saying, yes, you do this or can't you do it? And that's what's causing a lot of problems. You would hope that under next program that they would review the issues that came up under the last program and any kind of things that came out, and they would review that and say, okay, let's look at all the potential scenarios here, and let's have a way around them, But it is sometimes a learning curve for everyone involved, really, which it's not acceptable for the applicant groups, because they should have everything in place,
Yeah, and the other one then at the very end that nearly caught us was the insurance. You need to indemnify the minister, the department, the EU, everybody in the Republic of Ireland. And when you go to your public liability company and then your PI company, or it might be split across companies, and get them to put this into your insurance documents. Yep. Some of them will do it on straight away. Other ones we chase for months and months to get them to add it in. And it could have caught us at the very end. When we went for payment. And it's
it is. And again, it's a very annoying thing, because you're relying on a broker, let's say, right? I know we had the situation 3 years ago with a project where the broker came back, and in fairness, he did put in the indemnity clause and names the departments on this, but he rushed it and he named the wrong department. So he's going back and sorry, it wasn't the wrong department; it was the right department, but he got the name wrong. And he got the order of the names wrong, and they wouldn't accept it. So we had to go back and ask him, "Can you change that again?" And he was like, "Oh, this is ridiculous!" Even though it only could take a couple of minutes, he wasn't going to drop everything to do it for us, and it meant another 2 or 3 days delay. So. It can be very, very annoying.
But the funny thing with Leader and, other funding groups, not as much, but Leader, they didn't set the levels they wanted of insurance. Like, we could have 10 million or 1 million or 5 million.
Yeah.
All they wanted was that indemnity and the policy. That's all they looked for.
Yeah,
which is very strange,
Right, yeah, because nobody specified, and that does cause issues as well, because you got to go back and get if they've increased the indemnity levels on it, you got to go back and get that done as well with your brokers. So again, in some cases they'll ask you, have you got the insurance in place, and they look for you have to tick a box saying it's in file, and again, when it comes to audit, then you have to produce it. The issue there is a lot of groups say they have the insurance in place, but then when it comes to audit, they don't have it. Which causes more problems as well. Just another thing with that as well, similar to insurance, is tax clearance. Like most organizations know they have to have the tax clearance in place for their own organization, so their tax access number and reference number. But also when you're getting say contractors involved, you have to show that they were tax compliant at the date they got the contract. So what a lot of people do is they'll pay out the money first, and then they'll draw the money down. And at the drawdown stage, they'll ask the contractors for a copy of their tax clearance details, right, or their tax access number, and they submit that. But you have to show that at the time they got the contracts, they were tax compliant. So not so they can make maybe 3 or 4 more contracts, and you get your tax details at the end of it. the leader company want to see that tax access was actually was in play at the time they got the contract. And an awful lot of groups get caught out in that because they've no way of, because their tax access, when you're going to check someone's tax details on Ross, it's the date that you're going to check that comes up on the screenshot or on the printout. So you can't just go back and then retrospectively check if they were tax compliant at that date, and that causes problems. So I know some groups had to go back to their contractors, and the contractors had to get their accountants to state yes they were tax compliant at the date when they got the contract. So again, certain things of that can, which is very simple thing to overlook, because sometimes the leader companies don't make these things very, very clear at the outset, and they tell you afterwards, oh, by the way, you should have done this, but it's too late. So that's retrospectively telling you.
Yeah.
So just be careful with those two.
And the contractor needs the indemnity on their insurance as well.
Yeah.
Which can be a tricky one for them.
It can be like, it depends on the size of the projects, but like it can be very, very difficult for a contractor because they're literally changing everything to suit you as an organization, and it depends how the contractor and the contractor's accountant and their team are willing to to kind of accommodate you as well, and that can then cause problems and delays with drawdowns, which in turn causes problems and then getting, you get money in turns, which causes problems in getting paid. And it can cause an awful lot of rift between the contractor and the applicant group, because you're bringing the bad news to the contractor and it's being pushed on you by someone else in the local development company. So again, what we would recommend there is that when the contractor is getting the contract, that is very, very clear and written into this, these are the things you need to have in place. And so they're made well aware of it in time, and they have those things in place, and it's kind of a condition of their contract to do it. Because otherwise what happens is you're going to be chasing, and it'll cause you delays with everything. Just be careful on that. Is there any other areas that you've concerns with with the applications that you find that's going to be a struggle, or is there a way around, or what, is anything specifically that you've any questions you have for me in relation to the applications themselves before we move on to
just one thing that you brought up there is the level of indemnity. Just for some of the newer groups here, always watch the level of indemnity that IFI require. It's usually higher. Normally we have around 6.5 million is what's generic on our insurance policies, is usually 6.5 million, but IFI often require more, it's higher.
Okay.
So if you're planning on getting IFI funding for any particular project, watch out for that.
What sort of level do you look for this?
I think it's around 8 million, Trish, is that right? It's
I think it's definitely higher for the professional indemnity. I think their professional indemnity is 2.3 million, whereas normally it's like 1 million.
Yeah, max, yeah.
But I think the public liability is 13.5, and I think it's the normal.
Okay, sorry. So it's professional indemnity.
It's 13.5. It's the professional indemnity is the one that's much higher, which caused us loads of problems.
Yeah, your standard public liability is 6.5, and then employer's liability is 13.5. So like standard policy would be 13.5 employer's liability, 6.5 public liability. Yeah. And normally for public contracts, it's depending on the contracts, but it's about €1 million professional indemnity. But 2.3, that'd be high. There'd be there's a cost element there, but it's also a case of would you actually get that level of insurance? If you're looking for that level of indemnity, would a broker kind of say, well,
it's very tricky to get. Tom, a couple of things. First of all, just to let people know the situation in Donegal and whether that's going to be the situation elsewhere, I don't know. But the LCDC and Donegal County Council passed a requirement on all leader projects going forward that they have an environmental aspect on them. Now, it's not like, Rivers Trust are going to have, be very tuned into the environmental aspect of things, but it's going to be a requirement that all projects are going to be assessed against what are they doing, what's their impact on the environment. So that's going to be the case in Donegal, maybe in others as well?
It's going to be a case across the board with every application. Also, even I know with the RDF and URDF applications, there is a section there in terms of how your project impacts on climate action goals. So you have to show what the environmental impact of your project is. Now, for what you're doing, that's fairly obvious. But for other projects where there's no real environmental impact at all, they're literally scratching their heads trying to come up with something to put into the application that will tick a box. So we've got buildings where they want to put solar panels, they want to EV charging points, all this kind of stuff. But we've got Thai towns groups that are looking at them. There's you can very easily say, oh yeah, there'll be an environmental impact here, but the details that are required in the applications going forward, you have to actually specify they're going to. And then I say probably from next year onwards, and in leader applications and the next program, you have to probably measure those as well, which is going to be difficult. Very difficult. Because I know in certainly in the larger capital programs for URDF, they have to measure the actual environmental impact of their projects. So energy efficiency, all that kind of stuff, they have to actually measure for the buildings that they're applying for. But yeah, it is probably going to be a major part of the next program, but it is going to be built into all applications going forward.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, the second point that I just wanted to make, which might be relevant for other people here, is we had a very tricky situation with our latest leader pot that we got. Mm-hmm. So we were installing measures on a river, but of course you don't know in advance exactly how many measures you're going to do, or exactly what they're going to look like, or exactly how much they're going to cost. Mm-hmm. We had a very difficult time trying to get quotes for that. So, if you have any kind of experience in these kind of flexibility within the quotes, what we had to do was say, get the contractor to give us a price for a task. Uh-huh. And then we did a separate analysis on how many of those particular tasks that they would do, and then assess them all, across the same criteria that way. But uh-huh. And that was accepted, but it was very, very tricky to do. And it was really sort of trying to say in advance what exactly we were going to do. Whereas we had, it's very difficult to do that in the kind of work that we do. What exactly, I mean, Alan will understand this about how many styles do you actually need? And you don't really know until you actually go down and map the site, and you don't have that done yet, so, it's that kind of, have you ever come across? Yeah,
I suppose where we have come across it in we'd say contractors, right? Where for example, they might be let's take an example of one where we took, say, maybe a project. This project we're doing a project which is a recreational park and river walk project. Now, there's been no topographical studies on the land where this park is going to go to, and the cost of doing that is going to be high. So the group are saying, look, what we'll do is we'll get a local contractor, or whoever the contractor is they're tendering, they will put in a cost, but they'll kind of put in a contingency in there. Now that's very risky on behalf of the contractor, but they'll normally put in enough to give them a bit of leeway. So, for example, if it's a number, say the example number of styles, you might say, okay, we'll put in provision for 10 styles, for example, right? And that would be maybe sufficient. So you might need 10, they might only have to put in 6. So you kind of overestimate it as much as you possibly can. We've seen it for things like, say, the likes of, say, groups that are applying for training courses like this or consultancy funds, where they're not sure how many days they'll require. They'll kind of estimate it. And they say, we estimate we'll require 100 days, whatever it might be, and they'll get contractors' price on that. So it's really kind of unless you've got a very, very detailed specification and detailed brief that they can price against, you're asking the contractors to give an estimate really in terms of how much it will cost. That's the only way around it. They won't accept something like they won't accept that, say quotations come back from contractors or consultants, whoever it might be, and you're then adding more onto that. Do you know what I mean? So the quotations come in have to cover you for the cost. So what you find mostly, and it's happening at the moment with building projects because of the fluctuations in building prices, they're all putting in maybe a 30% contingency fee at the bottom to allow themselves that kind of that leeway, you know, to cover for inflation and cover for inflation in terms of construction prices. And that's what the way they're doing it. So they're taking their QS are taking the bill of quantities based on construction drawings and adding 30% onto the top of it to allow them that space. That's making projects very, very expensive. But if they don't do that and they come in higher than what the grant has been awarded, then the group will have a problem and come up with the rest of the funds. So you'd always overestimate it, but you'd have to justify how you're doing that. So if it's the styles example, you're saying, look, we estimate that we need the following, you know, maximum number of styles. And once they're all quoting for the same thing, that's fine. You know, so you're asking maybe to, you know, we've been asked, for example, with some training tenders we put in for, they'd ask you to put in for an estimated number of days training, even though they might happen, you know. If they get the grant in, they'd either go to that level or they'll just scale it back and don't draw on the full grant. But you try to keep, the main thing is that when the brief goes out, or there's the same brief to every single contractor or consultant you're asking to tender on it. If you have a situation where you're going to tender and there's no one around, or there's very, very few companies doing what you need to be done because it's very specialist, that's okay too, but you got to give a rationale as to why you've only got one quotation or two quotations. This happens a lot with equipment where there might be, you know, one main distributor for that equipment in Ireland, for example. So they can't get quotations from any other companies. They'll provide a letter then with the application saying that we've sourced this equipment elsewhere, but there's only one agent for that equipment or distributor for that equipment in Ireland. So we have to go with them. We have no choice. That would be acceptable, but you have to give the rationale for it. You need to talk to the leader company and get clarification that they're okay with that before it goes in as well. You know, so, but it normally does, like, you know, there's been 2 situations last year where they were for private companies that were buying machinery, and the only distributor of that machine that they had to use was only, you know, there was no company doing it, so they had no choice. So you could,
yeah, we had some issues with buying equipment that we got. Well, in one case, we got quote from England because we had only gotten 2 kind of local quotes, and we got 1 quote from England, and then we were forced to go with the one from England. Okay. Because it was cheaper, and we've had lots of problems with customs then. So yeah. I don't know, can you argue with them that you need to go local because Brexit?
Yeah, we had a situation there. It was after the application was approved with a project last December 12 months, and they had ordered I think it was about maybe 15 grand's worth of equipment, IT equipment and audiovisual equipment for a disability project. And they were kitting out their IT rooms and their classrooms. And they ordered them through, I think it was through Amazon they ordered them. And the supplier came back, and there was, because of the shipping issues that time, there was a delay of 3 months on the shipment. So they couldn't wait that long because they courses starting in January. They needed the equipment in before January. And they need to draw down the grant as well. So they went back to leader and said, look, we've got a situation here where we need to change the terms of our agreement. And they allowed them to change the supplier details because they had to cancel that order and go and find another supplier. But the issue was that they had to go and look for the equivalent equipment and everything else from another company. But they allowed them to because there was delays there. So it can get very, very complicated when you're dealing with this, and that's happened a lot. In the last 12 months, it's happened an awful lot where they went with one supplier, and that supplier wasn't able to fill the order in time. We had a situation there. We applied for funding for those privacy booths for offices, the pods, and we got a grant approval for it, and we went to order them, and it was an 18-week lead-in time. Which was gone beyond the term of the grant. The grant had to be spent by the end of the year. We wouldn't have got those stuff into March. So we went back and said, look, we can't do this. We need to change the terms of our agreement. And they said, it's fine, because we got a letter from the company saying it was 18 weeks. So sometimes you have to change. But what a lot of groups do is they ignore it, and they'll submit the claim with invoices from another company. They're going, what's this all about? So always talk to them early. Like any person working lead will say to you, it's like revenue. Talk to us early. Don't let something go so far that we can't do anything about it. So talk to them early and say, there's a problem here. There's always workaround around it. But they've got time to go back to the department to get clarification and get confirmation that they accept it. You don't want to be doing this thing like after the fact, because just then you're going to cause major problems for yourselves.
Tom, just on that, like when I've had to do that, we've had to have a change of supplier. So it's a change of supplier form you fill out.
Yeah.
But that has to, you send that in through your development officer and the leader company that you're working with, and then they have to get it approved by the LCDC. So that's the process. So you have, there's an approval time that you have to factor in, but it's a change of supplier form. As you said, if you give them enough notice, it can be done. And just tell them as soon as it happens, and you save yourself an awful lot of hassle.
Yeah, and also if you're changed, like in that example I gave there about the privacy boots, because we couldn't order those, we asked them, could we change the what we're applying for? And we actually went to build them ourselves, so we got a capital to build them, and they were saying, look, is the outcome at the end of this going to be the same? I said, yeah, there's going to be soundproof offices available for people, instead of buying them in, we're building them. They said, well, once the output or the outcome of the funding is the same, we're okay with that. So in other words, they said if we went off and we put in lighting, for example, instead of it, then the outcome will be different, because you weren't getting the same outcome, so they wouldn't allow that. So once you're not moving too far outside the parameters of your funding, they will accept it. They will accept the change to your application if the outcome is the same anyway. So again, this example would be relevant to yourselves would be, there was a group we were working with, they were looking at putting in it was a disabled angling platform. And they had quotations got for, I think it was like timber frame ones or something like that. And then they looked at our projects and they decided that they changed their mind and they were going to put in like a floating type of thing or a different type of system. But the leader company they were going to said, look, we're okay with that because the outcome is the same. They're still going to provide an angling place for someone in a wheelchair. The materials and the look is going to be different, but the outcome is going to be the same. So they allowed them to change what they're applying for after the fact. So again, there's a bit of flexibility there, but as Liz said, and I said earlier, don't leave it to the last minute to look for these approvals. Get them done well in time. It's a pain in the backside for the development officer, to be quite honest, because they're the ones that have to do all the paperwork and do all the stuff in the background. So if you're going to them last minute with a change, they won't be too happy. But if you go to them early enough, they'll be fine with it, So just be careful with that. Is there anything else before we move on to on issues, technical issues that come up? Because they're all technical things that I would consider. They're not, your content of an application. They're documentation, their requirements you have to have with the application. Is there anything else that the chief found issues with or have issues with?
Yeah, just be careful with the rear end of the leader process when you're looking for payment.
Yep.
You go through the whole process again. We need this, we need this, we need this. There's a section 48 check. And we need all your insurances again and tax clearance certs again, that everyone's up to date. And I'm just looking at emails here. I started this process or last a claim back in early October, and we still haven't got confirmation of payment yet. So we're looking at 3 months. 3 months process.
We're doing a project on our clients doing a project at the moment. They're waiting 7 months.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
And as you mentioned the last day, we have other grants we need to pay out on in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and we need this cash flow coming in. So we're going to hit a bit of a bottleneck now. So we are, because we didn't expect it,
Yeah, and I would say to everyone that's, and like I know leader companies will disagree with me on this, but I always say to groups that expect 6 months of a delay. Have that kind of in your cash flow management kind of process, because you could have where it causes huge problems for groups where they got bridging loans in play, and then they've got these loans sitting there that are being interest, accruing, and they're paying out interest constantly, and where it causes huge problems is for contractors, because contractors, if there's a delay in their payment because you've got a delay in your payments coming in, there's cash flow issues coming up, they'll start getting a bit kind of, I'm not too sure about these groups, we're waiting for funding, we haven't got paid yet. And in some cases, they'll down tools and move on to the next project because they're all very, very busy, and you lose them off site for a while, and then they're gone, and it just can cause massive problems. So always factor in, I would say to every group, have a 6 month kind of window there. Just presume that's going to take 6 months before the fund. No, it shouldn't take that long, but always have that. So if it's 2 or 3 months in, you're okay, but have a 6-month kind of window to allow that kind of wiggle room, because it's not so bad for smaller projects, but for large scale projects, you're dealing with, you know, big money, that can cause major problems. You know, if you're waiting for, you know, 30, 40 grand to be drawn down as a phase 1 payment, and you're going to pay phase 2 in a month's time, and you're looking at your bank account, there's nothing there, and you go back to the bank and renegotiate a further bridging loan. You know, it can get very, very messy very, very quickly. And it could be just one document, as you said earlier, it could be like a small one piece of paper that's missing or not signed. Just go back always back through the system again. That can cause all the delays, you know. And in fairness as well, and not mention any one company, but some local development companies are really, really good and have really good people working in there, and then others just don't. You know, it's some people, just some groups, just the staff aren't as up to scratch as other organizations. That can be very frustrating, because, you know, that's down to, you know, personalities within companies then, which is very, very annoying, where down the road maybe there's no problem with getting grants paid out, and then up the road there is problems with grants being paid out, which is very frustrating for groups, you know. You made a good point there, and the kind of the tail end of the grant process. I think I said this to you last week. Applying for the grant and getting the grant is sometimes the easiest part. It's trying to bloody get the money drawn down afterwards and getting it spent is the biggest issue, you know, because that's where the real bureaucracy kicks in. Okay, so I was going to share the screen there with you here to bring up this presentation for this evening. Where is it? Okay. Can you see this? Yeah.
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 Okay. So just got a very quick overview of what we covered, just looked at last week in terms of type of grants. You got specific grants, like your pilot funds, your one-stop funding, the basics, and you got your annual grants that are kind of, you know, a HSE funding or CSP projects that are an annual grants that comes up every year. The basic steps, again, research what grants are available for your type of project, know the deadlines and criteria, look at the aims of the grant, look at previous groups that award us funding, see if there's precedent has been set in other areas. And again, kind of the point I think Andrew mentioned a while ago in terms of the planning, if one planning authority has said this isn't, you know, is exempt from planning, you can get that information from other groups, and, you know, you go back to your own planning department then and say, look, this has been done elsewhere in the country, and this was what was agreed there. Have the consultation needs analysis done, have your project identified, have all your necessary documentation on file, and that's what we're covering this evening. Your generic application, I was saying last week, and it's something we recommend groups to have, is that if you've got one very good application done and it's been successful, use that as your template going forward for the other applications. A lot of it's cut and paste from previous applications. And then obviously you can make sure your application form is completed with all technical and support documentation that's required, that's provided. There's nothing worse than a grant being turned down because the supporting documentation wasn't provided or wasn't accurate. The grants planning template that we showed you last week, again, use this as kind of as a grants planning tool. So you're aware of what grants are available, where they're coming from, who the contact person is within the organization you're dealing with, what project you can assign the grant to, what are the application deadlines, what's required to get the application through, what information is required, how much work is required, is it worth it? Is the grant worth that amount of work? Then look at your actions in terms of, okay, what do we need to do to get this grant over the line, who's responsible for it within the group, and what deadlines are we setting. So it's a really kind of a good planning tool, like project planning tool for the grants. It just means that you get through the application process a lot more efficiently and effectively. And the more you do these, the more you use this kind of system, the better you get at it. But you can also go back as well, you see, and look at, okay, what do we do with a successful application? What do we do to get that over the line? And we use that then as a basis going forward. So a lot of groups just basically just do grants, they forget about them, submit them, get turned down or are successful, and they have to start the whole process over and over and over again every time they go for a new grant. You know, a lot of the work can be done up front and ahead of time. This speeds up the process. Again, sources of information on grants, your local public participation network, Again, as I said last week, some are better than others. They all have newsletters or should have newsletters with up-to-date information as to what's happening both within the county and what's relevant in terms of funding for their organizations. Funding Point is one you should be subscribed to. Active Link is free. And then the Climate Action Regional Offices have a good resource there for funding specifically for your projects. As I was saying last week as well, get on the main list of all the government departments, find out who the key people are on board, key people that are in the departments, get to know them and get on their mailing lists. So anytime there's an announcement of funding or press release announced by a minister, you get an email notification of that. It just means that there's information coming in from different sources, so you won't miss any grant opportunity. Not saying that every grant that's out there is going to be relevant to you, because a lot of them won't be. Not saying that you'll apply for everything that might be relevant to you, because you won't be applying for every single grant, because unless you need to. But at least you've got the opportunity and you're aware that they exist. I find as well that the water officers in each local authority area as well will normally kind of send out a list of all the projects that are, or all the funds that are available as well. So there's lots of ways of getting information. It's just really getting on mailing lists is a key thing. The two we use is Funding Point and Active Link. They're the ones we kind of dip into regularly. So why are applications turned down? The fund is normally oversubscribed, which is kind of the obvious one. There's way more people looking for money than money is available. The project is not eligible, which you might think, why would someone submit an application for a project that isn't eligible? But a lot of groups don't look at the criteria. Again, application received beyond the deadline. That's not so much an issue anymore because of online applications. You can't submit the application beyond the deadline anyway. So it's, the old paper-based applications, a lot of people would just get them in the post too late, or to get them sent in too late. But with the online, that's not possible anymore because it's closes at a certain time. Poor applications is probably the one that's like last year, because there's so many applications for COVID and there was so much money given out pretty easily, to be perfectly honest, that the standard of application writing is just gone through the floor. People, they thought it was easy to get money because there was a lot of the applications that went last year were, they were just given money anyway. And I saw some horrific applications last year. They got funded. I don't even know how they got funding, but they got them. The problem there is that no, that's the kind of the standard has been set, which is a good thing for the likes of yourselves that are going to put a bit of time and effort into putting good applications together, because the standard nationally will be down. But it's just, it's very, very annoying when you ask a group to say, okay, show me your application that you submitted that got turned down. And like there's spelling mistakes, there's just poor punctuation, they couldn't be bothered even filling out some parts of the form. That's just not acceptable, whether they're volunteers or not volunteers. That if you're applying for funding and you want to put your best foot forward, just there's no excuse for poor applications. No consultation shown, which is a big one again. Just, there's no reason, there's no rationale behind the project. And you're not showing anything to convince someone that you should be funded. Poor track record or no track record. Again, as I was saying before, civil servants and people working in local development companies, they like to work with organizations who have a good track record of getting projects off the ground, and they're experience of spending public monies and managing public monies. It's a bit of a risk taking on a new project or a new organization that they've no track record or they've no experience of dealing with, because they don't know if they're going to be good or bad when it comes to the administration side of it. So again, if you have a track record there, make sure you highlight that. And the key thing is that you've experience in managing public funds. Massive issue with for a lot of groups that don't have that. Support documentation not being provided or missing. Again, no needs analysis similar to the consultation. And then the last one, which is a massive one, is no matching funds. Or not meeting the matching fund requirements, or not providing documentation to prove the matching funds are in place, which is the big one. So groups putting down that they had matching funds on the application form, but not submitting, bank accounts or loan approvals, whatever, to match that or to back that up. Documentation is required. In some cases, they will look for, depending on the size of the project, will look for a strategic plan to be submitted with it, or a business plan or a feasibility study to be submitted. For smaller ones, they won't look for that, but it's no harm to have those things done anyway. So it goes back to the point that you're making there, Trish, in terms of how do we know what we need? Having even a very simple project proposal, well thought out and detailed in terms of what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, that allows you to take that information, put it into the application form. So rather than waiting for the application form to complete the application form, every group should have some sort of a project proposal first written down that they can use for the basis of the application, if that makes sense. So when we're doing any project, we'll do up a project proposal first and write that project proposal up, which basically outlines everything we're going to be doing within the project. And then we take parts of that project proposal and use that to fill in the application form. But it allows you to think the project through in terms of what you need to do, what we need to get costings on here, how it's going to work. And the application form isn't designed in a way to, it's not there to help you build your project. It's there to basically for you to explain what your project is about. Your project proposal is kind of the nuts and bolts of what the project is going to work. So we would do this project type proposal with everything. Now this could be, if it's a small project, that project proposal could be a couple of pages long only. If it's a big scale, large scale project, it could be 50 or 60 pages long. But again, it's looking at needs analysis, what's the needs based on, what's the rationale for this project in the first place? Does it tie in with our own objectives within our organization? Does it tie in with national policy? How are we going to operate the project? Is it financially viable? Have we looked at the numbers in this? Does it make sense? And what's the impact going to be? So by answering these questions at the outset as part of a project proposal, you've answered all the questions that will go into the application form. Okay, so there's nothing worse than having to write an application for an organization and you're asking them for information to put into a section on the application form, and that the first time they've been taught about that was when you've asked them. That's pretty much like going to an architect and saying, okay, we want you to design a house, but we're not going to give you any information in terms of what type of house we want. So you got to come up with something yourself and make it up. And that's the reality of the work, of the kind of work we do. You're often asked to kind of write a fictional application form for a project that could be anything, because they haven't thought through in terms of what they want. So it is that this doesn't have to take an awful lot of time. It's really sitting down in terms of, okay, what are we trying to do here, and how it's going to work, and have we thought it through? Again, if you're going to a contractor or a consultant looking for a quotation, they'd want a fairly detailed, brief in terms of what it is you want in place. And in a lot of cases, and I see this the whole time as consultant, groups come to me saying, Tom, can you give us a quotation without a very detailed brief? So, you don't know what you're quoting for. So have this done, even though it won't be a requirement for everything you're doing, have it done. So if you're applying for funding for a feasibility study, obviously that will lead to this anyway. And then you would use that feasibility study for the basis of an application for funding going forward. So the whole reason of doing feasibility studies is to see if the project is viable. And if it's viable and it's deemed viable and it's recommended to go forward, then you use that then as the basis for that application for the larger scale funding. So it's kind of the stepping stone to a large project. And every feasibility study should include this within it. So you have that done. But as I said, for any project, we would always do a simple project proposal. The documentation that's required outside that, and in the reports, again, a lot of groups have them, other groups don't have them. We're finding a lot of groups are putting their annual reports up online with a lot of images, graphs, charts, very kind of image focused rather than lots and lots of text. Again, just showing the track record of the organization. It's very easy for a group then or for an assessor to go in and check to see what you're doing. Annual accounts, you have your treasurer or your accountant will have those for you. One thing that's coming up a lot is that normally your accounts are for, let's say, last year. So your latest set of accounts will be for 2020. Your 2021 accounts won't be ready yet. But yet we're in 2022, so they will probably look for a set of management accounts, which an awful lot of groups don't have. Something I mentioned last week about using some sort of just basic bookkeeping software where you can present a set of management accounts for last year, which is based your income and expenditure for the last 12 months. Because they will look for it for the most up-to-date accounts. Your constitution memo or memos of Articles of Association, again, they should be on file. Quotations, I'll talk about quotations in a few minutes in terms of your procurement requirements. Planning details, again, as Alan mentioned earlier on, in some cases they look for full planning. In other cases, they might look for planning at all because it might be applicable, or they might accept the planning reference number that the plan application has been submitted and it's been assessed. Technical documents that would be required might be drawings, or if it's a building project, bill of quantities, surveys. any impact surveys or any of your specific surveys you might require to be included as well, have those in place. The proof of consultation, as I said, so you might have a project proposal, and you might have done a survey or something like that, or you might have consulted with stakeholders. Again, they might look for proof of those in the application, especially if it's an online application, but you reference that they're available on request. Like letters of support, for example, would be something that you might be allowed to include with the application, but you're letting them know that they're there if they want them. Tax clearance, again, your tax access number, reference number, any policy and procedures that you require, and they normally state the policies that they look for, or the policies that you have to have on file. And then the same with insurance. So in some cases, in the application forms, you're signing a declaration form stating that all these things are in place. And by declaring that they are in place and signing that, then you're saying they are in place. So when it comes to a drawdown, they'll audit that and saying you have to make those documents available to them and for inspection, if they look for them. But so rather than, and like any department don't want like every organization to be submitting loads and loads of documentation as appendices. So they look for that declaration form as kind of a quick way of saying, okay, yeah, we have all these in place. We're signing that we have them in place. If you don't have them in place, you need to get them in place by time an inspection is done. And again, the insurance we kind of covered earlier on. So with this, and this goes back to just simply file management, and it's like this kind of sounds obvious, but it's one of the main reasons why an awful lot of organizations don't get grants in on time, or don't get applications for grants in on time, or submit incomplete applications. And it shouldn't be, because it's literally just having stuff available and ready and ready to go. So what we recommend all organizations that we work with to do is to have a central admin folder that's available and accessible by designated people within the organization. Okay, so that might be 4 or 5 people that have access to this. So what we normally would do is they would have that up on a Google Drive or Dropbox or OneDrive, where it's available on any device via the cloud. So what you don't want is someone with this information on their laptop or on a USB stick, and they're on holidays, or they've resigned, or they've been let go, or they've gone on to a new job or whatever, or they're not available for whatever reason it is, and no one in the organization has a clue where any of the documents are. That's a disaster, and it happens the whole time. The other thing is, a lot of organizations, they kind of hand over a lot of their administration over to accountants and to bookkeeping services, which is fine, nothing wrong with that, but you should have a backup copy of all the documentation in your office. So a lot of people hand over all the documentation to their bookkeeper or their accountant, and their accountant has all the relevant documentation, like your memos, articles of association, the accounts, leases, all that kind of stuff. And you go looking for that then, and it's all the kind of case of, will they be there when I call them? Will they get it over to me in time? Because it's normally last minute. So have everything either as a copy or as a backup, but have it all available in one file, in one folder, on a shared drive somewhere. Now, you don't want that shared drive to be accessible by everyone, so there has to be designated people that would have access to those files, because obviously there's sensitive information in there as well. So the company documentation, things like, say, the ones that normally come up as problems would be your memos and articles of association. Had you got a copy of them on file? And a PDF is all you want of them. You don't need a hard copy. What documents are with your solicitor, what documents are with your accountant, what documents are on file with yourselves. So again, as I said, have copies of everything: leases, deeds, anything that's any legal documentation. You should have a copy of in a PDF format on your shared drive. So your members' articles of association, or deeds, your annual accounts, all those should be there. And it just means that someone goes into the shared drive, all that information is there. Now you can, again, on the shared drive, you'd have, you'd have split for years. So like, for example, you might have 2022, 2021, 2020. So your annual accounts for 3 years would be there. So again, it's very, very simple to get all that information when you need it. Insurance details, again, some people they know they're insured, but they can't find their policy details. So they don't know what their excess is, and they're contacting their broker to say, well, what's our excess on our public liability or professional indemnity? And again, it's not a big deal, but you're relying on someone else to come back with that information in time for you. Your tax reference number and access number, you get that through Revenue Online Services. through Ross. You'll also be able to check your contractors' tax details as well on Ross, so you can see if they're tax compliant once they provide you a tax access number. Again, what we normally do is just print that off, have it on as a PDF stored somewhere, so we have it and we can just put it into the application form. We have one organization, I'm not recommending this, they have a whiteboard in their office, in their admin office, and all their details in terms of their company reference number, the company number, their tax access number, all their important numbers that go into applications is behind the admin's desk on the whiteboard. That's not advisable, but have it somewhere where people can get access to it. List of board members. Again, sounds like an obvious thing. Sure, you know who the board members are. Yeah, but have you got their details in terms of are the date of birth required, their addresses required, their skills, their experience, what sector they're coming from, all those details. They'll only change when you bring on a new board member. Okay, so not going to be changing constantly. So they can be updated when they be updated. But again, have them on file somewhere. List of staff and volunteers. We would include there for staff members. We will have a simple template where we have the staff name. We normally give them a staff number as well, because that's required for like public funding. Use the staff reference number. We'd have their hourly rate, number of hours they work. If their work is split between two grants, so some cases organizations have, one grant will pay for maybe 4% of the administration's costs, and then the other grant will pay for 60% of it. We've all that split out. And the reason why that's split out in that very simple kind of table is that when you're doing the return, they look for that level of detail. So we won't have to go back and do it when you're doing the return. It's all there in front of you. It doesn't take that long to set these things up and keep on top of them. Again, volunteers, who they are, date of birth, their address, their roles and responsibilities, tick boxes. Have they been inducted? Have they been given an induction pack? Have they got the sufficient training? Again, so just keeping monitoring everything. And it's a good thing as well, if you're ever audited by a department and they go inspect your files and you're showing them all this stuff, it just shows them that you're running this organization very, very well. You're keeping on top of everything. Everything is being managed very, very carefully. And the reason why I kind of go with that level of detail is that in certain cases where, not every case, but in certain cases we're dealing with, say, the likes of Public, when it comes to employment grants, they would look for that level of detail, and they look for an awful lot of detail in terms of reporting back on what you're doing. And some groups are struggling to kind of gather that information in time for an inspection. Whereas if you're doing this regularly, it's all there. All your policy and procedures documents, again, like health and safety documentation, your risk assessments, your safety statements, your quality policies, etc. All the documents required. Normally, you won't have to provide them with the application, but you again have to sign a declaration form saying they're in place. They should be in place anyway. You're not just doing that for the sake of a grant. They should be in place. We were on a program yesterday, or a course yesterday on risk assessment and health and safety, and there was about 17 on the course. I think 16 people, I say, went for a strong drink after it because they realised, very quickly that they weren't compliant at all in terms of their health and safety requirements. And it's a minefield, an absolute minefield in terms of for every organisation, but certainly for community volunteer organisations where you got volunteers, staff, lots of things happening. So again, make sure they're in place and make sure they're done by, you can do a lot of them yourselves, but if they need to be done by an external person, that they're done properly, especially with health and safety and risk assessments. Your charities, right? So how many of you are actually registered charities? Just out of curiosity. So pretty much I can see all of you here on the screen just to. So just a show of hands there again. So 1, 2, so just 3 of you.
I'm going that way.
Okay. So if you're going on, and you're all obviously registered to Charities Regulator, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So you'd have, the one thing, I won't say it's a good thing because it's a bit of a pain, but the one thing with the Charities Regulator is that because their reporting structures and their compliance requirements, it is forcing organizations that have charitable status to adhere to all the governance code and policies and procedures anyway, because you have to. For those who aren't registered as a charity with the regulator and don't have to do the annual reporting to the regulator, you still should be kind of, even if you're not a registered charity, go to charity regulator website, look at the governance code, and you should be adhering to what they recommend in terms of good governance anyway. Because once you are, because that's kind of the gold standard really. Once you're compliant with that, you have no issue with compliance for any of the applications, for any of the funds. A lot of people are giving out about it. That's very regulated now, and it's kind of over the top. I'm not giving out about it because I think it gets organizations working properly when they're dealing with public funds and dealing with people's money. You're planning. Sorry, yeah. Some question there? No. Okay. The planning file again. If it's construction type project, again, have your planning file within your grant admin folder. That's really important because there's an awful lot of documentation that goes into planning applications and planning files, and your design and your surveys and reports, etc., etc., etc. And normally you'd have that could be held within your own, obviously within your own organization, but also you'll be relying on as well on your architect or engineer to have those copies of those as well. But a lot of organizations don't. They rely on their architect for everything. So their architect has all the planning details, and they don't have any. Make sure that you've got all the files and all the paperwork that you require. Have them stored yourselves within the office or within whoever is responsible for it. Again, it's just that that all this information is available to whoever is putting the application together at a click of a button. You won't have to go spend hours and days looking for this information. The planning reference number 1 is it's a very small thing, right? Because it's only a number. I could tell you that I know of, there has been 4 sports capital applications were turned down because the architect provided the wrong reference number to the organization. They put in the different reference number for another project. They rang the architect last minute, give us the reference number for the project, for a pitch or whatever it might be, or for dressing rooms or whatever. The architect very quickly gave him a reference number, and that went in. The department checked the reference number when the application was assessed, and the reference number was for a house or something, or for an office block. Okay, a very small thing. So whatever you're submitting, make sure if it's external number, like a reference number, for example, like that you're checking it to make sure it's accurate and correct. Things like air codes as well have caused problems where a person puts in the wrong air code for their project. Now that's a very small thing that can cause a problem with an application. Things like, say, the other ones we've seen would be bank statements. So a lot of organizations have a company name, and they've kind of got a trading name. So we're dealing with a company at the moment locally here, and they've got a very, very long-winded company name. So their trading name is called the Causeway Action Group, and their bank statement is under Causeway Action Group. Okay. Now, if they submit an application for funding and they submit their bank statements as proof of matching funds, the applicant name on the application doesn't match the name on the bank account. That will deem the application void. Okay, a lot of GA clubs have the same issue because they might have a number of bank statements under different kind of names. So they might have, like, say, development fund account, they might have something else, and because the applicant name is not on the bank statement, they won't accept the application. Okay, so there's a lot of small technical things there that will cause problems for you when you come to your applications, and that can be very, very annoying. Other things like dates being incorrect, documentation not being signed, all those things are other reasons for applications to be turned down. So I suppose the key thing is that you're organized, all information is on hand, very easily available, it's all very easily verified, and that there's someone or 1 or 2 people that are proofreading the application before it goes in and make sure all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed. Our rule of thumb for applications is that we would read them probably at least 4 times, and we would get at least 2 other people independent of me to read them as well before we sign off and before we submit them, because any small detail that's missing from it can cause an application or deem an application to be null and void, and they won't assess it. So the other thing that you need to look at too, again, it's down back to your administration. All the grants that you apply for, they would ask you the question, details of previous grants that you received. This can cause major problems because, again, people leave it to the last minute and they're like, oh, geez, we have no idea. We've got to go back and look, and they go back through bank statements, they ring their accountant, they ring around, say, when did we get a grant last? So what we do is we give out this simple template to our clients. Every time they get a grant approved, they put in the grant, the name of the grant. So let's say it's a leader grant, so they put in leader grant, the source, the local development company, the date the grant was received or approved, the purpose of the grant, the amount of the grant that was allocated, the percentage of the grant that was towards the project, the contact details of the person within the funding organization, include that also, because you might need information from them afterwards. Was the grant fully drawn down, yes or no? And the value of matching funds provided. The reason why I go into this level of detail is that on the some of the grant applications, they'll ask you, what was the grant for? Where was the source? When was the grant awarded? What was it for? How much of the grant was approved? Okay. Now, why this is important as well, in say the case of 1 year, right? Or sorry, 3 years, there is, you might be aware of the de minimis rule in relation to funding, where you can't 250 or 200 over the course of 3 years. So by keeping a monitor on what grants are coming in, allows you to see, okay, are we at a threshold here? We can't actually go for funding now because we're at that de minimis ruling threshold. What some organizations do, and it can be a fairly complicated way around getting grants, is they might have a number of projects that are operating under different legal entities. Okay, so they'll have, you know, a couple of companies operating kind of under one umbrella. You know, they're all kind of, you know, complementary as such. So an example of that would be a group we work with that they've got a community centre. The building's owned by one company. Within that building, they have a Meals and Wheels company that's providing daycare services and Meals and Wheels, and they've got a childcare company that's providing childcare, preschool and childcare, creche and preschool facilities within the building. Okay, so they've got 3 companies. So those 3 companies can apply for grants independently of each other. So it allows them to maximise the de minimis funding across the company operations, if that makes sense. Okay, now that's a larger scale type of example, but some groups, they just don't keep an eye on what grants are coming in, and they reach the de minimis before they know it, and cause problems for them. But you will be asked this question in terms of previous grants received, and no, it's a small thing. Again, you might think, well, it's going to take a couple of minutes, but if you got this done, it doesn't take, it takes a couple of seconds because we've transferred the data across. So it's important that you do something like this. Very, very simple template. Just keep an eye on it. And I said the reason why I put in the contact details there is that you might want to go back for clarification on certain things from the department. So, for example, if you weren't sure what date the contracts were awarded or grant was awarded, you see email them and say, can you send a copy of the grant agreement or whatever. So it's just, again, further information you've available to you. Okay, is there any questions on that in terms of documentation that's required or storing that documentation? It's all pretty straightforward, but it's just a lot of groups don't do it, and it would save them an awful lot of time and energy and effort if they had done it. Does it all make sense to you? Yeah? Okay. So the next thing then is, I suppose, where I really focus on when it comes to doing applications for funding. And it's where, the reason why I focus on it is where I try to find I suppose, an angle or an advantage over other organizations that are applying for funds. So if I'm being paid to do a grant application or for an organization, I got to make sure that they pretty much get it, or, you know, that the best possible chance of getting it, because that's, you know, otherwise why would we pay to do it? So what I try to do is I try to look at the strategic context, where this application fits in terms of local and national strategy. And the reason why I do that is because every fund that is made available, so every application that's open for applicants to apply for that fund, it has to come from somewhere. So it's not a case of a government minister or a bunch of civil servants in the department saying, do you know something, it'd be great now if we gave a fund for this project, or if we could create a fund for this work, right? That doesn't happen. What happens is that the government come up with policies, and they write policy papers, green papers, white papers, and policy papers on, you know, everything. So whether it be environment, whether it be employment, whether it be housing, whether it be, you know, homelessness, whatever, disability, whatever it might be, sports, whatever. There is a policy document somewhere that's sitting there that's basically guiding them in terms of what they're going to do in relation to this over a period of time, right? So if you take the main show in town at the moment is our Rural Future, the Rural Development Policy 2021-2025. Everything is stemming from that at the moment, right? So all the funds around, you know, COVID funding is coming from there. All the funding that's available for rural recreational funds, outdoor recreational funding is all coming from there. All the funds are available for enterprise development of enterprise units across the country is coming from there, and Leader is going to be coming from there. Okay, so what you need to do is say, okay, right, we need to look at what are the policy objectives within the rural development policy within the next 4 years, right? 3 years now because we're in 2022, okay? And what policy objectives within this overall development policy are relevant to us? And more importantly, what are the objectives that are relevant, that we're doing that are relevant to them, okay? So what we try to do is that we look at and we go through all these policies. So like I'm just putting a few there as an example, right? So the rural development policy is one, your county development plan for whatever county you're in, okay? And they're probably in the process. I know in Kerry we're on a draft development plan at the moment. It's causing a lot of problems for a lot of people. Your county tourism strategy, if your project has got a tourism element in any shape or form, even if only a small relevance in relation to tourism, look at it anyway. Your municipal district local area plan, so your local area plan for your local municipal district, your outdoor recreation plan for public lands and waterways in Ireland, and then your climate action plan. Now, you could also throw in there like sports council policies. It's in this. It depends on what your focus is on. I just put in them as examples, okay? So what I do is I go through, and it takes a bit of time, but it's well worth it. And if you only have to do it once, because these documents aren't written like every year, they're normally a 5-year process. So once they're launched and published, it's another number of years before they're done again. So it's not like you're going to go back to these things every year. So spend a bit of time when they come out to look at how does this document, this national, local, regional policy, how does it impact on our project locally, right? Very, very important, because what you're doing to them is you're now going to be referencing these documents when you're applying for the funding. In other words, you're saying to them in your rural development policy 2021-2025 that they're all singing and dancing about, you said as a government, we want to see the following happening in rural areas, okay? X, Y, and Z. You go back and say, in the application form, our project helps you fulfill the objectives outlined in your rural development policy 2021-2025, okay? And we go a step beyond that. So this is what we put into our application forms is this. Now, this seems over the top, complicated, time consuming. It is worth its weight in gold, because once you do it once, you don't have to do it again, right? So what we do is we put in a table like this. So we look at the policy documents that are relevant to the project. Don't put in stuff that's not relevant to, because it's waste time. So we look in the national, regional, local, and the EU policy, if we can get our hands on it, that are relevant to this project. Okay, so we put in the list them there. We take out the relevant objectives from that policy document that are relevant to this project. Okay, and they're as you can see to the right of the screen there, they're normally numbered. And then we say, okay, what actions and outcomes from the project action plan reflects or complements or helps achieve this objective, okay? So what we do very, very clearly and very visually is, you can see it from here in terms of, this is a project we did for, a rural regeneration development application we did for a municipal district sports project outside of Tralee, just outside of Tralee. And we said the project outcomes would provide sport and recreation space, provide accessible space for people with disabilities, expand community facilities for older people in the community, expand facilities for young people, promote local heritage, create opportunities, provision of co-working space, expansion of the efforts as the village, community council as a social enterprise, okay? And we then showed how each of these outcomes that we would achieve if this project got funding, how was linked to national policy and local policy. So we listed the policies up here, and we highlighted every objective that would be met by the outcomes of this project. Okay, that's a fairly strong argument when you're going looking for funding, because you're saying, if you give us the funding, we're going to help you as a government or a local authority achieve all these things. There's no point in you putting in RPO 169 as an objective if you don't fund groups to do that, because a lot of the things that they will put in their policy documents, it's not their responsibility to do it. They're going to basically give funding to organizations like yourselves to do this work on the ground to help them achieve their objective. Okay, so by showing them very, very visually, look at all the stuff that this fund is going to do. That's very, very powerful. Okay, now this is just kind of a summary one of us. Within the actual project proposal or feasibility study, we would actually go into detail in terms of how these are achieved. So to go back to this table here, we will put in how the actions and outcomes would actually help them achieve the objective. Okay, so you can look at let's say there's 3 documents or 3 policies or 3 national or local policies that are relevant to yourselves. You don't have to read them from cover to cover, because there's only certain parts of those policies are relevant to you. So if you take, say, a county development plan, and your project has nothing to do with employment, nothing to do with enterprise, nothing to do with housing, nothing to do with infrastructure, nothing to do with wastewater, heritage, or whatever, right? You can ignore all those sections. All you're going to focus on is the parts of that development plan that are relevant to yourselves, right? So what we do is very simply just download a PDF document from the department's website or from the county council's website, and basically search for keywords. So if it's environment, if it's river, if it's waterways, do keyword searches. So you go exactly to the parts of the document that are relevant to you. Now, if you've got time in your hands and you're bored, read them from cover to cover, but they are pretty boring documents to read, so I don't read them. But I spend probably a day, if I'm working on this now would be, this project was a 4.5 million project, so it's a big one. I would spend a day literally trawling through national policy, local policy, regional policy to see what's relevant that we can pull all of this and put and make a case for it. In some cases, the applications won't look for this detail, right? In other cases, they will ask to see how your project supports national or local or regional policy. Okay, especially if the project is around things like job creation, they normally look for that. But a big one for you would be back to this, would be the last one here. In terms of how your projects support environmental policies, it supports climate action plan and helps achieve that. All these things are relevant to what you're doing. So it's the reason why I spend time on focusing on this, because it is an area that a lot of organizations won't focus on, and they'll skip over it. And if they're comparing your project with another project, and your project is clearly showing them that you're ticking all the boxes for them, it makes it very difficult to say, well, yeah, we're going to go with the other project, which we're not really too sure what they're doing. You've shown them very, very clearly. I'm a great believer in visualizing very clearly in terms of having things listed have a lot of impact. Now, the person who's assessing the application might have a clue what the hell is NPO 28 is. It doesn't matter. They're not going to go and check it. They're not going to go back and check what NPO 28 is. If they do, fantastic, but they probably won't. But they can see very clearly, Jesus, this thing's hitting all the boxes first, So again, be very careful with that. Sometimes on the criteria that's provided with the application form, they will clearly state where this grant is coming from in terms of why this grant's being made available, right? So the one at the moment that we're looking at for the 2 projects, the Rural Regeneration Development Fund that's come up in the end of April, they very clearly stated, they've actually referenced the part of the rural development policy that they want to see that the projects have to reflect. So their big thing for them is the renovation of derelict buildings and vacant properties in rural villages, and about providing multi-purpose facilities and about providing workspace for remote workers. That's all coming from rural development policy. That's going to be their focus. So every organization that's applying for funding have to show that within their project proposals, have to show within their plans for their buildings. If they don't, they've been told to put it in there, so if they don't, it's madness. But sometimes they won't tell you, so you go back and you do it yourself and you put it in anyway. Does that make sense? Because it's really important from a funding perspective to give yourselves the edge over other organizations, is to spend that time. And as I said, once you've done it once, you don't have to do it again, because it's not going to change.
No, it's a good one, Tom. I like it.
It'll change every 4 or 5 years, and you just go back and do it again, but like a day. Okay. Matching funds then was mentioned earlier on. So the percentage of funds that are available for every grant will be clearly stated in the criteria. So it's not a difficult thing. If you got a grant that's 75% or 50% funded or 90% funded or whatever, then what your matching funding requirements are. Just be careful on the level of matching funds and what element of that has to be cash, because normally they will look for a minimum cash contribution. So it might be, let's say, 5%. So let's say you got a grant that's 75%, and you got to show 25% matching funds. They might state that 5% of that matching funds has to be cash, not a loan. It has to be cash in the account. not a letter from me saying that we will commit to having these funding available in the account when we need it. It has to be shown in the bank statement. Normally they look for 6 months bank statements to show that that money wasn't just transferred into the account the day before, to show the money was there and then taken back out again, because that was a classic trick of sports clubs back in the day with sports capital funding. They would do a whip around literally the day before the grant would go in. They would lodge the money into the account. They would get a statement showing the money in the account as of that date, or a letter from the bank manager saying that the account has the following amount in it. And then the grant application goes in, and then the next day they take the money back out again. To stop that, they've now looked for usually 3 to 6 months bank statements showing where that money is going into the account, okay, or where it's come from. If they allow you to provide, let's say, like say, valuation on a property or a site as contribution, which some grants will allow that. You've got to, and again, it's something we've just asked the department there literally last week about this with the RDF, because they will allow that. We've asked them in terms of what level do they need in terms of the evaluation. So is it, obviously you get an auctioneer to value it, but you can go to an auctioneer and say, we want you to value this property at whatever we want you to value it at, so how is it independently verified, that valuation? Okay. So we're working on a project where they need to come up with 200,000 euros matching funds. They're able to borrow 100,000 of it from Tancredo under a social loan. The building they bought was bought for 60,000 euros, and they're asking the auctioneer to value the site and building at 100,000 euros. Okay, so we've asked the question to the department, what level of detail do they require, and how do they verify that valuation? Okay, so just it's important because it is you're putting out there that it is matching funds. So the options in terms of matching funds would be money held in the account. That could be reserve that was in the account that was put aside for this project, or just reserve that's sitting there in the account anyway. It could be revenue from a fundraising drive that was done. And again, you would normally, and I'd be kind of suggesting this, that you normally put in on your application where that matching funds came from. Okay, I would normally, if it was done through fundraising, say that we fundraised for a specific project, we had the fundraising done, and match funds are in place. That's showing the funder that you've got capacity to fundraise when you need to fundraise, which is important. Okay, because it's a revenue stream coming in. If it's a reserve, but I would normally put in the application there that this funding is coming from reserves, and it's part of our reserve policy on our annual accounts. So I think it was sent to you last week. With your financial accounts, your accountants have to put in a reserve policy into the accounts. So if you've got, say, reserves sitting in the bank in terms of money that you reserved in cash reserves in the account, you've got to explain why those reserves are there and how those reserves are going to be used. So normally those reserves are basically reinvested back into the company or organization for other projects. So what we would say, look, that reserve is the matching funds coming from reserves, which are part of our ongoing reserves policy to reinvest back into projects within the community. If it's a loan, and again, this is an important one, if it's a bridging loan or a term loan, so you might be getting a loan for the matching funds, but you'll also need a bridging loan to pay for the project up front, because you get the grant retrospectively. They won't accept, in a lot of cases, just a letter from the bank manager or from Tancredo saying that we approve this loan of principal. The loan has to be approved and has to be stamped by the bank. Some grants have a template the bank have to complete, and that normally would have the amount of the loan, the term of the loan, the interest on the loan, and the monthly repayments on the loan. It has to be stamped and it has to be approved. So again, years ago, kind of a letter saying that in principle we're happy enough to give this project a loan when it's required. That's gone. Has to be actually approved now, because it's not going to take the risk that you'll get turned down for that loan when it comes to actually doing the project. And then the last one is the in-kind contribution, so property value, which I mentioned there, and earlier Trish mentioned about the voluntary labour contributions. So I was going to bring you into another slide for a second, if I can, on the voluntary labour contributions, just in relation to leader funding. Can you all see this? Yeah?
It's just come up now.
Okay, so this is just the guidelines for leader funding, the project funding guidance document. This is provided by North East West Kerry Development, the local development company here in North Kerry. So contribution in kind. The donation of land and real estate, again, is what they will love. With the voluntary labour one is important. So it's very, very important that you look at what they'll allow. So in this case, the case of contribution in kind in the form of unpaid work, voluntary labour, the value of that work and the rate applied must be duly justified in the application. The maximum rate allowed per hour is €14 per hour. Project administration and management costs are not eligible as voluntary labour. Okay, so there's normally in relation to it's going back to here. Where is it? Sorry, I thought I had was a different one. There's 2 seconds there to see where. Okay. Sorry, I thought there was more information on the breakdown of that. It might be another document. Just give me 2 seconds. Because there is specific things you look in terms of for on the voluntary labour side of it. Just on that as well, with the voluntary labour, if it says things like, say, electrical works or plumbing or anything like that is being signed off on, again, there's got to be someone overseeing that and supervising it. It can cause problems too, where you have someone supervising the construction works, for the purpose of the building control. You need to talk about that when you're talking to your architects, because they must make sure that everything's signed off on for building control purposes when it comes to the planning and the fire cert and DAC and all that, and sign off on the actual building itself. That if there's any voluntary elements of it done, that there's someone overseeing that and sign off on it. Let's see if I can find the. Okay. Okay, there's not. I'll see if we can get. Oh yeah, sorry, it's here. Can you see that? Is that PDF on the screen? Or is that, are you still in the Word document?
It's a Word document.
Okay, so I'll just bring this up again. Sorry, it's a different document I have here. Okay, can you see that, the PDF?
It's just come up now.
Okay, I'll send this on to you anyway as well, so if you don't have it already in terms of the leader guidelines. So this is the general requirements for voluntary labour. So the total claimed for voluntary labour donations included in the application. So it must be agreed on before the project is approved. So the details of the persons contributing to voluntary labour, the relation to the applicant, nature, time, quantity, and cost of the contribution, the qualifications that will enable them to make the contribution. So again, if their profession, time sheets. So this is one where it causes issues, right? So we've been involved in 2 projects where we're doing voluntary labour, and it caused major problems because the voluntary labour was actually being provided by CE scheme workers who were being paid under a CE scheme, and it caused major issues. Okay, because they were being paid under a scheme. But they were working on this project as volunteers, but they weren't, obviously, because they were being paid. So maybe like under normal circumstances, what you need to do is again, and this is where you're sitting down probably with your architect, and you're deciding to developing this up in terms of timesheets and terms of what they'll be doing. Again, the hours worked, relevant dates, activities undertaken, because this has to be certified. And this is where the point I was making. The certification is the issue, right? Your architect or quantity surveyor accountant is going to be, they're not going to sign off on everything that you say, okay, can you sign off on this, this, and this? They're not going to. They want to make sure that everything is done correctly. Because if, for example, it's it's work, say electrical work or plumbing works that are supposed to be certified, they need to make sure that work was done, properly and correct and all this. If you're just telling them that this work was done by volunteers and they're signing off on it, they need to be part of this process. So what happens in a lot of cases is that all this stuff is done, and then at the end of the day, the group goes to their architect or their accountant and says, can you sign off on this? And sometimes they're not willing to, because they're not willing to sign a document saying that they're verifying this because they can't verify it. So you get them involved from the outset. So if you're looking at voluntary labour, which is something you should be looking at if it's eligible for you, is that you plan it into your overall project and say, okay, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. It's going to take whatever number of days, number of hours. We've identified 3-4 people who are going to do it. And we've agreed this in terms of part of our work plan. And we'll discuss this with our engineer or architect or accountant, whoever we're dealing with at the outset, who's going to sign off on it. And it's being managed and monitored. Okay, that's really important. It's not that difficult to do, but what a lot of organizations, they don't do that. And it's afterwards when they're asked to report on it that they haven't done these things in place. And they're basically backtracking. It's not the best way of doing it. The other issue with voluntary labour is back to your insurance. Who's responsible from on site? So you might have the main contractor, okay, and you're saying to the main contractor, we're actually bringing in voluntary labour for certain elements of it. For example, it might be painting. So we've got main contractor on site, and we're going to get some local people come in. We've got paint supplied by the local builders providers, and we've got volunteers coming in doing the painting. Now there's an issue in terms of who's responsible for them on site then. Does it fall under your insurance? But you've given the contract to the main contractor, so they should be falling under their insurance. This is where it can cause problems, okay? So a lot of organizations do is they tend to shy away from the voluntary labour element of it because there's too many unknowns in relation to, the way it's done in terms of the funding. But the biggest issue is in terms of who's actually going to be responsible for them in terms of insuring them and who's going to be responsible for signing off on the work they do. Okay, it came up as an issue with a project probably 3 years ago where there was an electrician on site, and they said to the electrician, we can get a local guy he'll do the chasing, for you, and you come in and basically do the second fix, third fix, whatever it was, right? The electrician was unwilling to do that because he used to not to sign off on this at the end of the day, and I'm not responsible for the whole lot of it. So unless he's working for me directly, I can't do that. And he wasn't obviously working for me directly. So they couldn't use that element of it. It's normally down to insurance. So you've got to be very careful in terms of the insurance side of it, and also the building regulations as well, that the work is done to the satisfaction of the building regulations code. That's where your architect is going to have to be the building assessor or supervisor.
Sorry, Tom.
Yeah.
Tom, can I just interrupt there? So, we won't have architects. So if, let's say, we're doing a rivers work and things like that. So if we're doing a project like that, do we need to have a project engineer to oversee the project? And is it the project engineer that would sign off on the volunteers?
Yeah. Who would be signing off on the project anyway? If you were getting a contractor to do the works for you, who would be signing off on the work completed and done? Or is there a need for someone to sign off on that work?
I suppose I haven't been in that situation, but that's the thing that I need to that when we're planning a project, for in-stream works, is it like who do we need to have? I suppose a project engineer then, and that needs to be costed in.
Like if you're looking at building, if you're looking at any sort of building works or infrastructure works, whether it be say fencing or whether it be walkway or whatever it might be, who's responsible and says, okay, that work was done to, it's compliant and it's done satisfactorily.
For leader for their sign off, you have to get an engineer's report, and they have a little section saying that the requirements in the report from the engineer. So they give that specification, but a lot of our other funders wouldn't necessarily look for that.
Okay.
They might ask for pictures or something like that,
Yep.
and for the trust to write a report of the deliveries or something like that. But I think leader's the only first one I really come across that wanted a specific engineer's report.
So there'd be two emphasis, Alan, and there's one would be your requirements from the purposes of your funding. So I'm ticking a box from the funding perspective. So a leader to say, okay, we need an engineer's report. Other funding organizations might look for any reports to be signed off on this. Say, okay, the work is done. We see the work's been done. We pay out the money on it. Where I'd be more concerned is if there was an issue in relation to a claim down the line, okay, by a member of the public or whoever. So if you take, say, Alan, your example there, while you go with the stiles, for example, right? And let's say someone was climbing over the stile, had an injury, and claim against the organization that was responsible for it. And it goes back to tracks and say, okay, well, who built that? Who put in that there? Well, we got a few local lads put it in. Right?
Yeah.
And no, that's where I would think you're kind of on thin ice with, and that's why a lot of architects and engineers, when it comes to sign off, they're slow to sign off on work to be done on voluntary capacity, because there's no. If I pay a local firm money to put in do engineering works on a walkway or a river, whatever it might be, they're, if something goes wrong, I can fall back on that and say, well, they're the ones that did it. They were paid to do it. They said it was done correctly. It obviously wasn't done correctly. If that's done by a volunteer in a voluntary capacity, that's where the issue is. So I would say at every project you do, you should have someone saying that work was done to the required level. I'm not sure in terms of from an engineering point of view, from the rivers work or anything like that. Is there regulations you need to comply with? I presume there is. I know with building, obviously there is, which would be my kind of areas of strengths would be, you're kind of bound by building regulations and there's no kind of wiggle room around that. Where it comes to outdoor works, I would presume like there would be, there was some level of regulations and compliance that you would have to, comply with in terms of any infrastructure,
It's a grey area. Say for instance, styles, that's a grey area. IFI have specs, other groups have specs for structures that may not match each other's. Then you go across the water into England, they have different specs.
Okay.
So and that's why I say even with the planning exemption we got that time, they had nothing to reference to. So it's a tricky area, like it definitely is a tricky area. Yeah. And as you say, to get an engineer to sign it off or indemnify it, then that's another area.
Yeah, they won't like that anymore.
Yeah.
The day of kind of like, give me I'll sign that there for you. That's gone. Yeah. I suppose just Liz, go back to the point you made there in terms of how do you factor that into the cost. I would be, and it's not just from a funding perspective or grant application perspective or anything like that. It's more around from your own peace of mind that things are being right, is that there will be someone there that will be overseeing this. So if it is, say, works, any level of works, infrastructural works, that they be a brief and there be a specification there, and that would be done to that specification that you can fall back on it afterwards. I know it came up with that project I was talking about around with the River Walk. Their idea was that we just put on basically a very simple hardcore surface pathway through a field, but then questioning up around drainage and respond maintenance of that and everything else, and then they had to go back to the engineer and get a specification on the actual design of that pathway, which seemed over the top, but at least it was done to specification and that could stand over. So it is something that I suppose just from the voluntary element of it, it is something that will save you a bit of money. However, you got to look at, is there another level of bureaucracy here now that we're bringing on board that just, like, I suppose the way I would look at it is that if the money was very, very tight and the amount of funding that you have to put towards it is limited, and you're trying to maximize the grant date, yes, voluntary labor is something that you should be looking at or potentially could be looking at. If there's sufficient grant data, and you think, well, if we do through voluntary labor, we'll do it cheaper than if we get a contractor to do it. But if the funding's there for contractor to do it, it's so much easier to hand it all over to contractor and they take care of it and they do everything and they sign off on it, because they're responsible then as such. Where if you're doing kind of the mixed match of like project management and you're bringing in direct labor, some voluntary labor, that becomes a very complex space then for the volunteers that are managing that project, and not just during the project itself, but afterwards if there's any issues that needs to be addressed. So I know a lot of groups that have gone down this route. They've had no problems with it. I know other groups that have gone down this route and it's been an absolute nightmare. And I know groups that have basically ignored it because they just don't want the hassle of having to deal with it. It's like kind of building a house by direct labor as opposed to getting a main contractor. It's always more expensive main contractor, but less hassle. And that's, it's really equivalent, I suppose just again, summing it up, we would always have either a project manager within the group that is looking after this, or that is being assigned to an engineer or whatever that's looking at the specifications, or they come up with the specifications and they make sure it's done to the specifications as well. I think and you can factor that cost, if there's a cost in there as well, factor that into the overall budget as well. But you can include professional fees for all these projects.
Okay.
Unless they specifically state you can't, but if they don't, I would say put in some cases too. And again, I suppose with the planning side of it. So, and again, I shouldn't say this out loud, but I'm going to say it out loud. If they say that they don't allow certain things to be included in terms of professional fees, so for example, if we're getting, say, funding for a feasibility study and 70% of that budget is going to an architect in terms of fees, what we normally do is the group come to us and say, look, we can't cover their fees for planning, or we can't cover the fees for project management, let's say, because it's not part of the feasibility study. We'll ask the architect that they've identified to actually increase their fees, so that when we pay them, because they're paying to be paid directly by us, so it's not coming from the group, that we can pay them the extra fees that covers them for work they're doing outside of the brief of the feasibility study. If that makes sense. Okay, so it's something that, it all depends on what sort of relationship you have with the people who are doing this work for you, but there's kind of ways around it, So on paper, they're getting paid for X, Y, and Z, but they might also be doing A and B as well for within that budget. Okay, because last thing you want to do is they've been paid to do work, but the actual work you really want them to do, they're not being paid for it. So just be careful of that. So you can sometimes we include the project management afterwards in this as part of the overall fees. Okay, but if they allow it, put it in, absolutely. Otherwise, you're going to be doing it. So again, this is the way they look at the funding breakdown then. And I'm going to send this on to you. So again, contribution client 65,000, contribution 5% contribution. So again, this is the breakdown that they have of the grant and what you apply for. Okay, so it's not overly complicated. It's just more to make sure you're ticking the boxes with it. The other thing then, let's come back to here before we finish up this. Sorry. Okay, so it's matching funds. The other thing then is on the procurement guidelines. Now you're all pretty familiar with this. Again, in terms of your procurement. So if it becomes leader funding, so if you're applying for a feasibility study grant, you basically if it's less than 25,000 euros, that's ex-VAT. Okay, so a lot of people think that's inclusive of that. If it's ex-VAT, it's 25,000 euros plus VAT is fine. You need to have 3 quotations. Now, this is important because this is where a lot of groups make mistakes. You have to make sure that the brief that goes out to the consultants is exactly all the same brief. Okay, you have to give a deadline for receipt of quotations back. You have to provide proof of receipt of the quotations. Okay, so if that's an email quotation coming in, you've got to show a screenshot of the email being received or the data was received. If they obviously post it, that's fine because it's coming in hard copy and it's posted. But it's just that some groups, what they do is they don't get the required number of quotations in by the deadline, and then they get the quotation maybe emailed to them a week later, kind of a dummy quote. But the receipt of the quotation was after the deadline, and that causes problems for them as well. So it might be accepted. If you can at all, try to keep the thresholds below 25,000. Now we had a situation there just before Christmas where we tendered for a contract down in Cork, and it was coming in at 24,950 plus VAT. And even though it was below the threshold of 25,000, the leader company in this case insisted that the client or the applicant go through a full e-tendering process, right? So he had to scrap original process where you got 3 quotations and you had to go back and put up on e-tenders. They were saying it was too near the threshold, and they were more comfortable that it would go up on e-tenders, right? So he had to go through the e-tender process. E-tendering is not a problem. It's not a major issue, but it just means that you want someone locally to get the work, and you've identified someone and handpicked someone to do it. This just opens up a massive problem for you now, because you've got anyone could apply, anyone could tender for it. Okay, a way around that is that if you want to, I suppose, set the budget, and if you want to kind of target a specific person or company to do the piece of work, a way around the kind of the most advantageous quote is by setting the budget, because most companies will go as far as the budget, whereas you leave it open. You can have a situation where your budget is 20,000 euros, for example, right? And you've got a local person that's willing to do it for 19, but then someone up in Dublin or someone wherever will come in at 14. Now you got a problem, because you got to go for the lowest tender in most cases, unless you can justify a reason not to go for it. So if you can at all, try to keep it below 25,000. What you can do is split the project out into different elements. Now, for feasibility studies, it's going to be below 25,000 anyway, but in this case, like I say, it was a large scale project. You can split it out, so you can actually split it into 2 lots, and they tender so you get 3 quotations for 2 elements of the project. Just keep below the 25,000 threshold, if that makes sense. So you split the project into 2. So 2 elements of it, and you go for quotations for both elements. But for feasibility studies, unless it's a huge project, it should be less than 25,000 anyway. Again, as I said, you have to provide the tender brief, has to be on file, and has to be a list of the people you contacted, a copy of the email that you sent them, inviting the tender, copies of the email that you received with the quotation attached to it. And then an email also showing the email that went out to the unsuccessful tenderers and the email to the tenderer that was awarded. Okay, again, small, simple things, but when it comes to the project file at the end when it's been examined and inspected, if all these things aren't in there, you're now doing some serious backtracking in terms of getting documents that were never there, kind of getting them there, and can cause major problems. So again, simple things is just follow, like we have a simple process that we follow when we give our clients, and they follow it, is ticking the boxes to make sure they've just done everything they possibly can. It doesn't have to be the lowest quotation, and make sure that that's clearly stated in the tender brief. Also include in the tender brief as well that it's subject to funding. That the tender and the award of the contract is subject to funding being made available as well. You should advertise it by right, but if you know of someone that wants to do it, you go to them and you basically, they're the ones going to be quoting first, and they probably providing you with the other tenders as well, or at least giving you names of other people to tender for you. Normally, the local development companies, when it comes to leader funding and feasibility studies, would have a panel of people that they recommend. You don't have to go with that panel, but they normally do have a panel that the people they recommend. It normally doesn't really matter from the application perspective who you're getting to do the work. So if they like, for example, if they didn't have to like a consultant, that's not going to impact on your application. They can't say we're turning this application down because we don't like Tom O'Leary or something, right? That shouldn't impact on it. Once you've shown that the company tendered for it, they provided their tax access details, they provided their insurance details at the point of applying, they're the most, the lowest tenderer. That's all very fine. If you have a situation where you can't get 3 quotations, you have to show that you tried to get them. Okay, so you got to show where we advertised it, we got to show where we emailed 5 consultants, 2 of them came back and said they weren't interested, 2 didn't bother their backside come back to us at all, but you got to prove that. You can't say we couldn't find any more quotations. You got to prove it, and you got to show the emails back from them. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that for this evening, and what we're going to do next week is go through the application form. So what I want to get through to you this evening was more so around that the actual application form is normally the easy part of this. It's all the other technical things around, especially leader funding, more than any other funding. There's some technical stuff that they look for that if you don't have it in file, don't have it at the time, in time, it won't be accepted. Just with the leader funding specifically, there's 2 processes involved. You've got an expression of interest process where you're basically expressing interest in applying for the fund. That goes in first. That gets assessed. If that's approved, they then give you the go-ahead to actually get a full application in. Okay, so you can't put a full application in without going through the expression of interest format. That's a very, very simple form to complete. Just give them a very brief outline of what you're trying to do, how much it's going to cost, how much you'll be applying for. It's really to make sure that your project is eligible under their criteria and under what strand of funding it's going to come under. They'll come back to you and say it's been approved. Submit your full application. Okay, you normally, depending on when they're meeting, you normally will have probably 2 months to get the application in, because they normally meet every 2 months. So you've got that period of time. That's not a lot of time to get an application in if you've got all supporting documentation to be provided. If it's a feasibility study application, that's straightforward enough, because there's not a whole pile of information you need to provide at that point, because it's purely early stage project. So you get turned around pretty quickly. Normally when the application goes in, it goes through the 3 assessment process. So the internal committee review it. It goes through the lag, and then goes through to the department. So there's a couple of hoops that go through. So it's not assessed very quickly. The development officer who's working with you on the application, and normally you bring them at the very beginning. So they're kind of overseeing the application with you to make sure there's nothing in there that's going to cause problems. Once they're happy with it, they should be fighting for you at that assessment. So they should be pushing this project through for you. Once you get the go-ahead, then you can drive on with the project. Okay. What you can't do is start spending money on the project prior to the project being approved for funding. Okay, because you can start, like you can start work, but you can't pay anyone. So officially you're not supposed to start on it. In a lot of cases, people are doing work in the background, which is fine. But you can't go back and say, okay, we got invoice from Joe Bloggs there before the thing was actually approved at all. That's not going to be allowed. So it's really down to timing with Leader, and basically working with them in terms of what they will and what they won't accept. And as we mentioned at the very outset, sometimes they're not aware, not too sure themselves. They need to get kind of clarification from the department. Sometimes the department move the goalposts around a lot mid-game as well. So they tend to kind of, rules kind of, we've been involved in 2 projects last year. The rules were just kind of all over the place, and one group was saying one thing, another local company saying another thing, the department was saying one thing, another civil servant saying another thing, and it got very politicized, and eventually they agreed with the very, very first decision was made, but it took 3 months to get that agreement. So it can be a bit of a long-winded process. I suppose the reason why we're kind of focused on it is that, one, it's because it's the most complex one. It's a handy one to if you can get through this, you can get through any of them, but also it's really the main show in town, and will be in 2023 for 6 more years, because it's going to be the main program with the main source of funds for you. Have you questions on what we covered this evening before, and then we'll, as I said, we move on to the actual application form itself in terms of next week, in terms of what goes into it. Does that all make sense, or are you okay with it?
Tom, can I just bring up a point that might be relevant to some of the trusts here?
Yep.
If you have a contractor, we had advertised for a role, and the contractor that was awarded it in the end was a trustee. Now that will happen a lot with trusts, because we're very specialized, and sometimes the best person to do the job is within the trust itself. So, I mean, that was fine, and it was okay with Leader, but we then had to, it was only afterwards that we found out that through the accountant that we had to have all this documentation around that approval. So just to be aware of that we had to have it minuted at a meeting, and all the time that it had been discussed as a board, which it had been, but that had to be minuted, and then that had to go into the charity regulators and into the CRO as well.
Were they director of the company as well, Trish?
Yes.
They were, okay. So that's where you went into nice there, like, yeah. Okay. And the accountant advised on what you needed to do to get around that. Okay.
Yeah, but it was not a problem with the grant. Let's say it wasn't a problem with Leader.
Okay.
But it was an issue with the CRO and the CRA. Yeah,
and the regulator.
So it's just it's not, just to be careful with what you're doing.
Yeah,
just make sure that.
I'm amazed it wasn't a problem with Leader, though, because normally it would be, where it's normally pretty, specified that.
And it wasn't a problem for them, no.
Right.
I mean, they knew it was a very specialized job, and they knew that, you know, it was very difficult to get quotes for, and they were happy enough with that. We just, you know, told them that, and that was fine.
Right.
But it was only afterwards with
Yeah, no, because it came up as an issue for myself. We applied for, because I've been 2 companies. I have my own company, and we have the co-working space company, and the co-working space company applied for an Enterprise Ireland grant, and they were allowed for consultancy fees to basically provide a kind of a strategic plan for the project. Now, I do strategic plans, so I said, okay, well, O'Leary and Associates could apply for it, but because I was director of both companies, they wouldn't allow it. And we argued this, you know, why are we paying someone else, you know, to this work? We do this what we do, you know. But they wouldn't allow it because there was basically, I was director of my own company and I was director of, so there was conflict of interest there. They wouldn't allow us to do it. That's what I'm surprised the leader allowed it. But no, it's interesting, yeah, because it is a situation where it does. The other thing as well that comes up is where it might be necessarily a director, but it might be a spouse or a family member or a person related to the director that gets contract, and that can cause problems. I think there's a conflict of interest declaration type form that's be filled out, if I'm not mistaken, with that. But yeah, it's an interesting point though, because like in small communities, like, you know, people are related to each other anyway, you know. But yeah, it's an interesting one, yeah. But it'd be more of a situation probably for the CRO, as you said, rather than necessarily the leader company. Okay, any other questions? Are you okay with that?
Oh, that's good. Okay. I think it's time to say goodnight.
Yeah,
it's 20 past 9.
So we go with 7 o'clock next week, next Wednesday night.
Yeah, please.
Yep.
That'd be great.
And it'll be just focusing next week purely on the application form. So we'll be going through, you know, what needs to go into that. And just with Liz, with the Zoom link, is it going to be the one that?
Yeah, it's the one that you see, because you registered, and I used the registration on Zoom because then I know who's turning up. You have to go back to the one that you registered with. So go back to your first email and just put it into your calendars.
Yep.
For the next meeting, and there you'll have it. Is probably the easiest thing to do. And Tom, you'll send out the slides again. What I'm particularly interested in is getting the table where you had, you know, where all the compliance with all the different strategies. That's one of the best things I saw tonight in terms of, like, I mean, that we're basically making our applications fulfilling government policy, our government objectives.
Okay, perfect. And I'll also send out, if you don't have them, I'll send out those guidelines, the leader funding guidelines as well, just have them file. Not they'll be changing at the end of this year, but they're relevant still, like, at the moment.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Great stuff. Thanks, Emily. We'll talk to you so next Wednesday.
Lovely. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.